The lunchbox came up first. Red plastic corner scuffed a strip of masking tape dulled to the color of old bone. A backhoe's teeth let it slide across a plank of frozen soil like a skater losing edge. When I brushed off the dirt with my glove, the letters showed through a child's name written in a mother's hand. Snow ticked against the brim of my cap. Everything else, the tall pines, the idling trucks, the hiss of diesel in air, cold enough to sting, fell away. Let me know where you're listening from, and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. I used to measure winter by the sounds it swallowed. Pine Hollow sits in a shallow bowl of land where snow settles and stays muffling the clatter of daytime and turning the town to a kind of hush after dark. Back then, in '94, my patrol car's heater took 10 minutes to push warm air, and the radio chatter rode in on a bed of static. I had a young man's appetite for overtime, and a middle-aged man's back even then, though I wouldn't admit it. Nights on shift, I knew every porch light and what time each went off. If someone left theirs burning past midnight, I noticed. Mornings belonged to the school bus routes. You could set your watch by the yellow noses rounding corners, brake lights blinking at the same mailboxes, a quick wave from familiar drivers. The Route 42 bus turned off Oak Street at 7:47 on most days, spilled heat from its door in little ghosts of steam, and carried half the neighborhood's kids across the 2-mile stretch to North Briar Elementary. The route wasn't a map so much as a promise we'll be there. We'll bring them back. Norah was one of the Finch Avenue kids. There's no reason you should have known her name then. That's how safe it felt. She wore a purple knit hat most mornings, even when the temperature bobbled above freezing, and her backpack looked heavy enough to anchor a canoe. I'd pass her corner if I was headed to the east side and get the quick, polite chin lift she gave grown-ups she recognized nothing more. She took up space the way good kids do, quietly and completely. No trouble, no noise. Her mother Dana worked the B shift at the packaging plant off County Road 7, paper goods, boxed by the pallet, loaded 6 deep onto trailers. She timed her life by whistles and brake bells, and I don't think I ever saw her without a hair tie around her wrist and a pen tucked behind one ear. We'd met across a folding table at the high school gym during a neighborhood watch meeting. I remember the way she wrote Field D on the sign-in sheet, as if anything more Dana was a luxury. She didn't talk about the father, and I never asked. In a town this size, privacy is the only gift we can give each other freely. The school held to routine because routine kept everything upright. Carol Minnie at the front desk sorted attendance slips by mid-morning, her fingernails clicking gently against the edges as she stacked the pink and yellow copies. I once saw her catch a kid's name before the teacher even realized he was late. Principal O'Keefe kept a brass bell on her office shelf and a ledger she updated by hand. We all joked that if the power ever went out for a week, the school would function just fine, as long as Carol and the ledger made it through. Then came the strike bus drivers, not teachers, right in the middle of a winter that had already overstayed its welcome. The Union Hall sits behind the bowling alley on Maple near the dumpsters where the snowplows push a dirty mountain every January. Red Macon, the union rep, had a way of speaking that folded anger into careful sentences. He didn't want to leave roots uncovered. I believed that. But he also wasn't going to cave because a superintendent waved a calendar at him. They posted flyers held a vote, and then the yellow buses that had been our town's moving clock hands fell still. The first morning after the air felt wrong. Not dangerous, just off. Parents did what parents do, carpools drop-offs older kids shepherding younger ones. We got a call about a fender bender by the north lot as 2 SUVs tried to squeeze through at the same time. No injuries. Mostly you heard the extra noise doors slamming. Boots scraping the thinner breath of a schedule stretched too tight. Route 42's absence was a gap you could feel. Without it, Finch Avenue looked wider and a little less certain. I drove past that stretch a little before 8 and slowed habit more than anything. The corner where the kids usually bunched up was bare. The snow had a crust that squeaked under the tires, and the moon had left a last dull shine on the asphalt. I watched my own exhaust drift in the mirror for a second and kept going. At the plant, Dana ran late by 4 minutes. Not the end of the world, but she knew her line boss kept track. A friend on her shift told me later that she arrived with her gloves in her teeth, tying her hair while stepping into steel-toe boots. She'd leave as soon as the horn blew at 3:20, she said. Her daughter knew the drill, knew how to get home, knew the rule about calling from the office if plans had to change. Norah's steady people would say. That was the word, steady. It was cold that week in a way the TV didn't bother to dramatize single digits most mornings, the kind of air that burned your nose hairs and made every breath feel like it needed a warning label. The river wore a quilt of rough ice that clicked against the culverts when trucks rolled past on the overpass. I logged a couple of calls. No one remembers now a garage door frozen half open, an elderly man's furnace cycling too often. I ate a sandwich in the squad car and watched a red-tailed hawk balance on a telephone pole as if the wind was a chair he'd pulled out just for himself. What I remember most is how normal the day insisted on being. Normal is stubborn like that. Carol's attendant's stamp thumped at the front desk. The playground's chain-link fence rattled once when a gust pushed through. At the Union Hall, Red's voice rolled low and measured over a pot of burned coffee and talk of point-of-service contributions and seniority lanes. "We're not looking to break the town," he said. "We're looking to be seen." At the bus yard behind a locked chain, the decommissioned rigs sat in a row, their paint fading to a softer yellow windows milky with age. If you climbed the fence, which kids sometimes did after hours, you could see dust skating in the sunbeams through those windows, the way particles learn choreography when no one's watching. Maintenance tags flapped in the wind on a few mirrors, dates, signatures, a shorthand that meant something to the men with grease under their nails. I'd pulled in there a dozen times over the years on calls about teenagers cutting across the lot, and never once thought the place had a secret to keep. I spoke with Mr. Hellberg at a diner up on Route 18 that week, where the heat lived unevenly under the table, and the waitress knew every striker's order by the sound of the boot that crossed the threshold. He stirred his coffee for longer than it deserved, old fingers pinching the spoon like a violin bow. "We'll get a contract," he said more to the linoleum than to me. "I don't like being out. Kids need the bus." He told me he missed the 747 turn from Oak the way the Thompson twins argued about who got the window seat. "A bus isn't just a ride," he said finally. "It's a promise." Promises cost time and attention, and both felt thin by Friday. The police phones did their usual dance between quiet and busy noise in short bursts and then calm again, as if the town had learned how to breathe through a paper bag. I made a note to swing by Finch Avenue the next morning just to keep an eye on the traffic there with parents improvising drop-offs. Habit again. If you stood on Finch with your eyes closed, you could sort the neighborhood by sound. The early snowblower with a bad belt behind the white ranch on the corner, the screen door with a spring that always snapped in 2 beats on the green duplex, the dog that yodeled more than barked somewhere down by Alder. The kind of catalog you make without meaning to, stored away like the combinations to old lockers. Dana's porch light burned a soft cone onto the walk most weeknights, a rule she held to with a quiet discipline on at dusk, off by 11. The bulb had been replaced 3 weeks earlier. I know because I helped her yard side while she steadied the ladder. She thanked me by pressing a paper plate of cookies into my hands, the kind that flatten a little in the oven and cool with a shine you can see your fingerprint in. "For the station," she said, "and then keep one for yourself. You learn to hear small cracks before they become fractures. A call that usually comes at noon lands at 1:15. A crossing guard pulls her scarf high and looks longer down the road before stepping out. A storm miss on Channel 3 turns to flurries anyway, and drivers remember how bad the bridge can get when light snow hides last night's glaze. They're nothing any of them taken alone. They're a change in the draft under a door. Sometime that week I started carrying a little notebook again, the thin kind you can fold in a back pocket. Not for anything in particular. just because the days felt like they were slipping past the edges, a bit like snow off a roof in slow motion, silent but sure. I wrote down a plate that circled twice around maple and alder and didn't stop. I wrote down who left for Florida already and who promised me they'd check on Mrs. Klein's hydrant when the plow bermed the street. When a place you love shifts under your feet, you reach for paper as if ink could tack it back to the table. That Friday, we had a forecast of 6 degrees at dawn, wind from the northwest at 10 miles an hour, and a dusting of lake-effect snow by morning. I checked the salt spreaders at the lot and logged a reminder to swing by the footbridge near the mill. In the squad room, someone had left a thermos of chili on the hot plate with a note, "Eat it, or it'll burn." I poured a cup and let the steam fog my glasses for a second. The radio crackled with the usual traffic stop welfare check false alarm on a storefront motion sensor where a plastic plant moved just enough to matter. At the plant, Dana traded a pinched laugh with a woman from her line about weekend laundry. "Fold in front of the TV to make it sting less," the woman said. "That's the trick." Dana nodded, pressing gloves flat on the table. She told her she might run late that afternoon depending on how the new palletizer liked the cold. "It hates February," she said. "Don't we all?" She didn't say it with any weight. No foreshadowing, just the way people talk when winter has lasted one storm too long. I finished my shift near 9, scribbled a few notes that wouldn't matter in 6 months, drank the last cold inch of coffee and stepped outside. The air had sharpened into ice skate air, the kind that lifts the hair on your forearms, as if it has a memory of summer it wants to defend. On my way through town, I passed the bus yard. The chain on the gate tapped metal with a hollow clack. Inside, the rows of retired buses sat in their dusk like old cows in a winter pasture, flanks dusted with frost-blind windows turned toward nothing. A block from my own place, I took the long way, as I always did past Finch, a slow roll down Alder, a glance at the river. Dana's porch light was still on, steady as a heartbeat, casting perfect circles on the snow that had drifted across her walk. Across the street, wind pushed a skinny trail of powder along the curb the way salt moves in a shaker when you tilt it just so. No cars passed. Somewhere far off, a plow blade snapped sparks against a manhole cover. In the silence that followed, I listened for the sound I'd come to trust on winter nights, the hush of tires turning onto a familiar street, a set of headlights easing up to a curb, a door closing, boots scuffing wood steps, a key finding home. I waited an extra minute in the idling car, letting the heater fan soften the frost from the inside of the glass. The porch light didn't blink. No beam swung across the front of the house. The snow kept falling in tiny, stubborn grains. Then my radio ticked once, just once, and went quiet again. I drove on slow and careful, and when I cut the engine in my driveway, the night folded closed around me. A cold draft worked under the door when I went inside. I hung my coat, stood there, listening for something, anything to tell me the evening would end like every other. Down on Finch, one porch light burned a little longer than usual, painting a gold square on the snow that nobody stepped into. That night, after I turned off the engine, I sat for a long time, watching my breath fade against the windshield. The porch lights down Finch were still burning. You could feel how heavy the cold had gotten, the kind that bends tree limbs and makes metal hum in its sleep. I remember telling myself I'd check the roads early, maybe swing by the bridge before the school zone filled up. I didn't know, standing there in the dark, that the next morning would redraw the shape of our town for good. The call came in just before 8, right as I was topping off coffee at the station. A mother saying her daughter hadn't come home from school. Her voice wasn't panicked, not yet. It was the kind of tone you use when you're still trying to sound reasonable, hoping the words themselves will make things normal again. She gave the name Norah Field and said she'd checked with her daughter's friends, the school, even the neighbors. No one had seen her since morning. I told her I'd be right over. When I stepped outside, the air bit hard enough to sting my gums. My tires hissed over a crust of snow as I turned down Finch. The houses there all looked the same in winter plumes of smoke from chimneys. Wind chimes, frozen stiff driveways, scraped just wide enough for one car to slip through. Dana met me on the porch, coat half-zipped hair still damp from the shower she'd taken to fight off the panic. I could tell she'd been pacing. Her gloves didn't match. "She never made it home," she said, voice catching on the word never. "Her boots are gone. Her lunch isn't here and—" She stopped herself, pressed a hand to her face. I asked the usual questions last time, seeing what she was wearing, if she'd mentioned any change in plans. Dana's answers came out in small, brittle pieces. Purple hat, gray snow pants, black coat with pink lining. She left for school like always. Said she'd figure out a ride because of the strike. Inside the house, Nora's things were lined up neatly, the way kids try to keep order when they don't have much control anywhere else. Her backpack was on the chair, half unzipped, homework inside already done. The bed was made pillow, still holding the shape of her head from the night before. The only thing missing was her lunchbox and boots. Everything else looked frozen in the last morning she'd lived there. I called the dispatcher to log the disappearance and asked them to check with North Briar Elementary. The secretary, Carol Minnie, confirmed what I already suspected. Norah had been marked absent at 7:56 a.m. No one remembered seeing her on campus, not in the hallway, not in homeroom. It had been chaos that day, substitute drivers, carpools, half the usual staff juggling double duties. Carol's voice lowered when she realized who I was talking about. "She's a good kid, Sergeant. Maybe she caught a ride and forgot to call." She didn't sound convinced. By midday, I'd looped through every likely route between Finch Avenue and the school, 1 mile on paper but a hard mile in winter. 2 overpasses, 1 footbridge that hadn't been salted in weeks, and a stretch of wooded road where snowplows never quite met in the middle. Tire tracks faded into ruts and disappeared under drifted snow. No sign of a struggle. No tracks smaller than a size 9 boot. It was as if she'd been plucked straight from the morning air. At 4 that afternoon, we sent out the first alert. Officers canvassed the neighborhood while I met with Principal O'Keefe in her office. The blinds were half drawn and you could see the gray afternoon light slipping through in thin ribbons across the desk. She told me about the strike again, how the district had scrambled to patch routes with volunteers and substitute drivers. Everything was handwritten, she said, pulling a sheet from a folder. Half of these people weren't even from Briar County. Her hand trembled slightly as she slid the paper toward me. The line that stood out read, "Route 12X, 7 students, picked up 0, dropped off." "Who drove this one?" I asked. O'Keefe shook her head. "No one knows. It wasn't supposed to exist." That night I brought the sheet back to the station and stared at it under the desk lamp until my eyes blurred. The ink had faded from blue to a bruised gray, but the handwriting was sharp, clean, deliberate. Someone who wanted to look official. The initials at the bottom didn't match anyone on the district payroll. We ran checks on every bus still registered in the county, all accounted for except one Unit 42. Decommissioned 2 months earlier for brake issues, supposedly stored behind the depot fence with the others. I drove there after hours, floodlights cutting through fog that had settled low over the yard. The gate was locked, but the second chain had been replaced recently, bright new metal against rusted links. Inside, the buses sat in their usual rows, but one space was open near the back corner, snow smooth and untouched. No tire marks in or out, just a hollow where something large should have been. Back at the Fields' house, Dana was sitting on the couch clutching the phone like it might ring if she willed it hard enough. The TV was on mute, showing a rerun of the local weather. Her hands were trembling, but her voice had flattened into something that scared me more than panic, a quiet, exhausted certainty. "She wouldn't run away," she said. "She doesn't even like crossing the bridge alone." I told her we'd keep the search going through the night. Volunteers from the plant were already gathering at the town hall, bringing coffee and thermoses and flashlights that barely cut through the cold. Around 10, the temperature dropped below 0. Snowflakes turned to fine needles that stung when they hit your face. We fanned out along the riverbanks over the bridge down to the tracks that cut through the edge of Tiller's Grove. Each step crunched too loud. Every flashlight beam looked like it stopped a few feet short of forever. By morning, the snow had filled our footprints, and the only sign we'd been there were the flags we'd planted to mark our grids. I drove home long enough to change and pour coffee that tasted of metal. My reflection in the kitchen window looked older than it had the day before. Sometimes that happens when a child goes missing. You feel time bend. Hours stretch thin and then snap back all at once. At the station, a new stack of flyers waited on my desk. Norah's school photo smiled out from the center, her green eyes too alive for the word missing printed beneath. The town's rhythm shifted overnight. Storefronts hung the posters by the doorbells. Kids were walked to school instead of riding with friends. Every yellow bus that rolled through town drew a longer stare than the last. On the third day, a call came from a driver in the next county claiming he'd seen a bus parked on a logging road north of Route 18. I drove out there with a deputy following tire impressions that froze solid overnight. They led to nothing but a pile of cut pine and a burned-out pickup. I still remember the smell of resin mixed with ash, sweet and wrong all at once. Weeks blurred together after that. Each lead melted into the next until none of them meant much on their own. A neighbor swore they'd seen a yellow bus heading west that morning. Another said they saw Norah walking alone toward the bridge. Each claim contradicted the last. The bus logs went missing from the school office one night, just gone, as if the paper had decided to vanish too. Theories filled the air like snow runaway stranger abduction, wrong place, wrong time. But every version had one missing piece that refused to fit. I carried Norah's description in my pocket, worn soft as cloth. 4 feet 9, 84 pounds, brown hair, green eyes, purple hat. It lived there like a heartbeat, reminding me what the town had lost. Dana stopped coming to the daily briefings after the first month. I didn't blame her. The hope we kept offering had started to sound like apologies. One evening I stopped by her porch to drop off a new flyer draft. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from the stove venting next door. She opened the door only halfway blanket around her shoulders and said, "They all keep saying time helps. But it doesn't, does it?" I told her the truth that time only changes the shape of the hurt, not the weight of it. She nodded once as if she already knew. By spring, the snow melted down to gray patches along the curbs. The river thawed, carrying broken ice like slow-moving glass. We'd found nothing. No coat, no lunchbox, not even a single print that made sense. The case drifted into what they call pending follow-up, which really means waiting for luck. I tried to accept that, but I couldn't. Every time I drove past Finch Avenue, I saw that corner again. The thin girl in the purple hat stamping her boots to keep warm, waiting for a bus that shouldn't have come. Years passed like that. Some nights when the wind blew just right, I'd dream of engines idling in the cold of a door hissing open of children's breath clouding against glass. Pine Hollow healed on the surface, new pavement, new shops, but underneath there was still that empty space where certainty used to live. Then 30 years later, the phone rang again. It was a young deputy voice, tight with disbelief. "Sergeant," he said, "you might want to see this." Out near County Road 18, a construction crew digging drainage trenches had hit metal under the frozen dirt. They thought it was a trailer at first, but the more they cleared, the more yellow showed through. I drove out before the area was even taped off. Snow was still falling in fine grains, coating everything in a pale shimmer. The crew's excavator idled beside a wide hole. Beneath the churned soil, a rounded roof glinted faintly under the lights, paint faded but unmistakable. A school bus half buried by 3 decades of weather and silence. The air around it felt heavier than the cold could explain. I leaned against the fender of my truck, staring at the shape that had haunted our town for most of my life. Somewhere inside that metal shell was an answer I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. One of the workers, a kid no older than Norah, had been lifted something from the dirt and held it toward me. Red plastic corner scuffed a strip of masking tape dulled by time. My heart stuttered once and I heard myself whisper the name before I even read it. Norah Field. And just like that, the silence we'd lived with all those years finally cracked open and the truth began to crawl its way back to the surface. By the time I got to the site, the crew had already cut the engine on the excavator. The wind carried that metallic smell you only get when frozen dirt meets old machinery, half rust, half oil. Floodlights threw long shadows over the field, catching on tree trunks glazed with ice. The yellow roof of the bus was just visible, bowed inward like something trying to exhale after too many years underground. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the crackle of snow under boots and the low murmur of men who didn't know what to say out loud. 30 years of silence had led to this one metal shell in the dirt. I told the deputies to step back, called the coroner, and waited. When we finally peeled the soil away, the side windows came into view, dark, some shattered, others fogged from within. Inside, a single figure slumped in the driver's seat, hands still gripping the wheel. The coat was green, the leather gloves cracked and stiff. The bones underneath told the rest of the story. He hadn't walked away from that bus. I'd seen my share of recoveries, but this one felt different. There was no violence in the posture, no struggle. Whoever he was, he'd stayed there sealed up in his own crime scene. A few seats back, we found its small red edges, dulled masking tape curling but legible enough for my stomach to drop. The same name I'd carried in my pocket for half my life stared back at me. Norah Field Room 6B. Inside, a half-rotted apple, a Capri Sun pouch, and a folded permission slip dated February 7th, 1994. For a second, everything in me went quiet. I'd looked for that lunchbox once, and here it was, waiting like it had never left the morning it disappeared. Sheriff Elena Mendez took over as lead once the scene was secured. I'd retired years earlier, but she'd called and asked if I'd come down anyway. "You were there at the start," she said. "You should see how it ends." Only thing was, it wasn't ending. The man in the driver's seat didn't match any of the substitute drivers from that week. His teeth and jawline didn't match local records, and the VIN on the bus had been filed off and scorched as if someone wanted to erase where it came from. We sent the remains to Madison for analysis, but the quiet that followed felt too familiar. A week later, I got a call from Elena. "You should come by," she said. "We've got something." The old case file. My case file sat spread open on her desk, yellowed and brittle. She pointed to one entry that used to make me lose sleep. Route 12X7 students picked up 0, dropped off. I could almost see the handwriting again, the same neat print that had fooled the district into thinking someone official had signed out that bus. Back then, I said we thought it was a clerical error. Elena shook her head. It wasn't. Forensics had dated the driver's death to the same week Norah vanished. Male, mid-50s, about 5'9". Cause of death undetermined, but signs of blunt trauma to the skull. No wallet, no ID, no jewelry. Just a brass key stamped J26. It took another 3 days to trace it to a defunct storage facility 80 miles south, a place shut down years ago after flooding. The unit had never been reopened. I tagged along when they pried the door open. The smell hit first wet wood rust mildew and something else, something old enough to feel like time itself. Inside were milk crates stacked to the ceiling. A mattress collapsed in on itself and boxes labeled only with dates. The light from Elena's flashlight caught the edge of a photograph pinned to the wall. It showed a yellow bus parked in a clearing. Standing in front of it was a small girl with a red lunchbox, smiling like she wasn't sure she should be. Behind her, a man in a green jacket had one hand on her shoulder. The back of the photo said in thick black marker, "Day 1." She's perfect. The room went still. I remember my throat tightening as Elena called in evidence. I stared at the walls, water stains flaking paint outlines where pictures had once hung and been torn away. We cataloged everything: children's drawings, newspaper clippings, notebooks. One clipping showed the headline I'd seen all those years ago: "Local girl missing parents plead for information." The edges had been smoothed flat, preserved. It wasn't a memento. It was a record. Later that night at the evidence lab, they powered up an old VHS player and threaded one of the tapes recovered from the crate. The footage was grainy, black and white, and filled with static. A man's voice, calm, coaxing. "Say your name for me, sweetheart." A pause, then a child's voice, quiet, careful. "Norah." Louder, the man said. "Norah Field." Another pause. "Now the way I taught you." The voice trembled slightly. "Norah Schultz." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the monitor. The man spoke again, slower this time. "Good girl." I felt my chest tighten. I'd been a cop long enough to hear the patterns, the controlled tone, the rhythm of someone teaching obedience, not kindness. Every part of me wanted to walk out, but I didn't. The next sound was a small piano melody off-key, the kind you find on toy keyboards. After that, the tape ended in a hiss of static. Forensics pulled 3 more tapes, each labeled in pen with a single letter and number. N2, N3, N4. None of us wanted to see them, but we had to. The sheriff's team transferred them to digital, sealed the originals, and sent a report to the state. What came back was worse than anything I'd imagined in 30 years of looking over my shoulder at that case file. He hadn't killed her right away. He'd kept her, fed her, taught her things no child should have to learn. There were notes, page after page, describing her schedule like lab data, wake time, meals, behavior corrections, sleep. The title at the top of the binder read, Project Blossom. Elena called me into her office after the lab confirmed it. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "We're dealing with more than one case," she said. This wasn't random. It was a system. On her desk were stills pulled from the tapes. Different girls, different rooms, the same voice directing them. Some older, some barely out of kindergarten. And in the corner of each frame a yellow mark like paint or chalk shaped like a small flower. That night I drove home in silence. The snow had started again, the kind that floats more than it falls. My house felt too bright when I stepped inside, so I left the lights off and sat at the kitchen table. I thought about Norah's mother, about the way she'd asked if time ever helped. I realized then that time doesn't heal. It hides until someone digs deep enough to wake it up. 2 days later, Elena held a press conference. She stood under those hard fluorescent lights, reporters' microphones pointed like bayonets, and said the words we'd avoided for decades. The disappearance of Norah Field is now classified as an abduction and long-term captivity case. The headlines ran before sundown. I watched the coverage on the local channel, Dana's old interview clips playing alongside footage of the excavation site. She hadn't spoken publicly in years, but that night she called the sheriff's office herself. "I want to see what you found," she said. When she arrived, they gave her gloves and a chair beside the evidence table. She looked smaller than I remembered, thinner. Her eyes locked on the lunchbox sealed in its plastic bag. "That's hers," she whispered. Then she looked up at the photo of the man. "That's not Mr. Hellberg," she said quietly. "That's not our driver." Her voice trembled on the next words. She would have believed him. If he said he was covering the route, she would have believed him. After she left the room, stayed heavy with the kind of silence you can feel on your skin, the kind that makes you wish you didn't know what you do. I drove home past the old school that night. The building was dark except for the security light by the flagpole. The playground fence creaked in the wind, the swings half buried in snow. I thought of Norah sitting on that bus seat watching her town blur through fogged glass, trusting she was headed where she belonged. In the days that followed, federal agents took over, widening the search beyond Wisconsin. The locker key had led us to one room, but there were likely others. The man had moved across states, changed names, buried his past as easily as he'd buried that bus. They found connections to another missing child 5 years earlier in Illinois, same physical description of a man with glasses and a trimmed beard driving a bus that didn't exist on any schedule. The child in that case was never found either. I went to bed that night with the sound of Norah's voice still in my head. Norah Schultz. It wasn't just a recording, it was the echo of a stolen identity, a life rewritten by someone who wanted to own her story. I closed my eyes and tried to picture her face as she might have been now grown, living under some other name. But the only version that ever comes is the girl in the purple hat waiting on a corner in the cold. The next morning, Elena called again. "We've got another lead," she said. "Old farmhouse west of town. Looks abandoned." She didn't say what made her think it mattered, but I heard the strain in her voice. That's the thing about cases like this, they don't die quietly. They keep calling you back piece by piece until you follow them to the end. As I hung up, I looked out at the first light breaking through the frost on my window, and I realized something that I hadn't been able to admit for 30 years. Finding her body wouldn't be the end. It would only be the beginning of what we'd buried with her. The truth doesn't rest easy, it waits. And that farmhouse waiting out there in the woods with its shutters hanging crooked and its air gone stale was about to tell us the rest. The farmhouse sat back off a dirt road, the kind of road that looked more like a scar than a path hemmed in by pines that hadn't been trimmed in years. When we pulled up, the wind was barely moving, just a low hum through the needles. The place looked half swallowed by its own yard roof, sagging siding grayed to the color of old newspaper porch steps broken through at the middle. No mailbox, no tire tracks, no sign that anyone had lived there since the century turned. Still, when I stepped out of the truck, I had that old instinct rising in me, the one that tells you something's waiting to be found, whether you're ready for it or not. Inside, the air was cold and sour with mildew. Every surface had a skin of dust thick enough to show your breath when you moved it. The front room still held the shape of a life, an old recliner, a tipped-over space heater, a TV with the back cracked out. Next to it, a stack of newspapers from early '94, the top one folded to a headline about the bus driver's strike. The date stopped me cold. I traced it with my thumb just to be sure. I could almost see him sitting here, then reading about the very chaos he used to take her. We swept through room by room, slow and quiet. I could hear the sheriff's boots creaking on the old floorboards. In the corner of what must have been a kitchen, empty cans of Chef Boyardee were stacked like trophies, their labels long faded. On the refrigerator door hung a child's crayon drawing yellow bus, big windows, a stick figure inside waving. Above it, in uneven handwriting, Daddy takes me to the trees. I don't know what made me sicker, the childish loops of the letters or the word Daddy written so proudly. Down the hallway, one door was different from the rest. Newer wood, pale and unpainted. No knob, just a hole where the hardware had been. Someone had sealed it from the outside. The edges were splintered where nails had been driven deep. Elena ran her hand along the frame and looked at me. "You feel that," she said. The wood was cold, colder than the air around it. We called in a team to pry it open. When the door finally gave, a cloud of dust rolled out so thick I had to turn away. The room inside was small, maybe 10 by 10. The walls were pink, the kind of pink you find in paint meant for little girls, faded now to a grayish blush. A narrow bed frame stood against the wall, its mattress collapsed inward. Plastic toys were scattered across the floor. Cheap ones, cracked their colors, still too bright for everything else around them. On one wall, someone had taped paper drawings, flowers, animals, a bus again. The tape had yellowed, curling at the corners, but the images were still there. Beneath them, scratched into the baseboard in small, uneven letters, I saw words carved by a child's hand. "I miss outside." Next to it, another one. Day 434. Elena's voice broke the silence, low and careful. "She was here," she said. No one answered. The sound of the camera shutter was the only thing that moved. In the far corner, a metal bin held the real evidence: VHS tapes, notebooks, loose photographs. I picked one up at random. The tape label read Project Blossom Phase 1. Another said Behavior Mod Set 3. The handwriting was neat, steady, professional. It made me think of someone who took pride in their work. We carried everything out in silence, boxed it up, loaded it into the vans. The drive back to the station felt longer than it was. The sky had turned the pale gray of evening snow. I kept thinking of those scratches in the baseboard, how deliberate they were. 434 days. Someone had kept count. That night the lab digitized the first of the new tapes. I stood behind the glass while they played it, my arms folded tight just to keep them from shaking. The picture flickered, and there she was. Norah. Her hair longer now, her face thin, older, but unmistakable. She was sitting on the floor of that same room, staring straight at the camera. Her voice was small. "Can we go outside today?" she asked. A man's voice answered from somewhere off-screen, calm, almost gentle. "Not today, sweetheart. The world outside is sick. We're safe here." She hesitated. "But I miss Mommy." The voice came again, firmer now. "I'm your daddy. Say it." After a long pause, she whispered, "You're my daddy." I stepped away before the tape ended. There's only so much you can stand to hear before it stops being evidence and becomes something else entirely. The tapes kept coming. More girls, more rooms, more of the same voice. It wasn't just Norah. There had been others. Wendy Bree Haley names scrawled on the labels. Each one had her own version of the pink room, her own notebook of routines, wake-up food lessons, rewards, punishments. Each voice grew quieter over time, until silence became the only thing left. The sheriff's office became more a morgue than a workplace. Those weeks' lights dimmed blinds, drawn people talking in whispers, because talking normal felt wrong. Then came the moment none of us expected. A clip surfaced from a gas station security tape in Jefferson County, dated May 2012, years after we thought she'd been gone for good. The footage was grainy, but you could see her 15 or 16 maybe standing beside a man at the counter. He was paying for motor oil and batteries. She stood behind him, motionless eyes fixed on the ceiling camera. One iris darker than the other, same as the old photos. Norah. The man wasn't the same one from the early tapes. Younger, taller, different posture. When the clerk asked if the girl was okay, the man smiled and said she didn't talk much. And right as they turned to leave, Norah glanced back at the lens. Not scared, not pleading, just aware. Like she knew we'd be watching one day. The FBI joined the case after that. They believed the first man, the one who took her, hadn't acted alone. He'd been part of something larger, a system that moved children across states like stock inventory. They found evidence of aliases, Donnie Schultz, Kevin Willis, and finally one name that made every hair on my neck stand up: Eldred Halverson. It tied back to a small elementary school in Montana, closed since '92. In a yearbook photo, a custodian in janitor blues looked straight into the camera, smiling slightly. Same eyes, same shape of the jaw, just younger. The caption read E. Halverson. He'd been there years before Norah ever stepped on that bus. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept picturing the web of it. The fake buses, the fake drivers, the rooms, the notebooks, all connected by one man who'd spent decades hiding in plain sight. The thought that he'd been trusted inside schools made me sick. Somewhere between those tapes and that farmhouse, he'd built a business out of captivity. And if Norah had been alive in 2012, then he'd been selling obedience long after we'd stopped looking for her. When the FBI traced the last alias to a warehouse in Illinois, I went along, even though no one asked me to. Part of me needed to see it. The building looked ordinary, from the outside gray concrete faded loading docks, but inside it was a museum of everything he'd done. Rows of filing cabinets coated tapes, digital drives labeled with dates. One drawer held a stack of invoices, neat and precise donations disguised as education media purchases. The ledger's final entry was dated 2017. By then, Norah would have been 34. Back at the station, Dana was waiting in the hallway when we returned. Her hair had gone completely gray, but her eyes were the same green as her daughter's. We didn't show her the tapes, just the still frame from the gas station, the one where Norah looked up at the camera. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears welling without sound. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my girl." For a moment, everything around us fell away, the case, the years, the noise. Just a mother seeing proof of life after 3 decades of grief. But the relief didn't last. The man in the footage was still out there, and the more evidence we found, the clearer it became that Norah hadn't been the only one. There were at least 7 others across different states, all with the same blank stare, the same stillness in their posture. Each time, a man with glasses or a short beard, polite and visible, paid in cash. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Norah's voice again from that first tape, small, uncertain, calling a stranger daddy. We thought we were chasing a kidnapper, but what we were really chasing was a machine built on control. When we mapped the connections, the pattern stretched across years and counties, through storage units, cheap motels, and ghost identities. It was like following the shadow of someone who knew exactly how to disappear. By spring, we'd linked him to a grain storage site just over the Minnesota line. Fresh tire marks in gravel that should have been untouched for decades. No paper trail, no owner on record. Just another forgotten corner of the map, quiet and waiting. The FBI set up surveillance slow and methodical. I stayed behind watching the feed from the command trailer. When the breach team went in, you could hear the wind howling through the microphone, that same hollow sound of winter air moving through iron. Then, after a long silence, a voice came over the radio. "We've got someone." The camera feed steadied on a small, pale figure sitting against a wall, wrapped in a fleece blanket with cartoon unicorns on it. She was older now. Face thin, hair tangled, but her eyes, one lighter than the other, were unmistakable. "What's your name?" one agent asked. She blinked, hesitated, then whispered Norah. Norah Field. I wasn't there when they brought her out, but I saw the footage later. The way she stepped into the light, blinking, unsure if it was real. 30 years of darkness ending in a single blinding moment. They said she didn't cry. She just kept looking around like she was waiting for someone to tell her what to do next. When they asked if she knew the man's name, she said quietly, "He called himself Daddy. But sometimes he said his name was Halverson." That was all we needed to hear. The rest would come later statements, recovery, a reunion no one thought would happen in this lifetime. But that night, standing outside the command tent, I watched the sun sink behind the pines and felt something I hadn't felt in 30 years. Not peace, not closure, just the faint pulse of hope that maybe for once the story wasn't going to end in a grave. The next morning, as I drove back through Pine Hollow, the town looked different. The air smelled of thawing snow, and the school buses were already out, kids leaning against the windows with their lunch boxes on their knees. For a second, the sight of them nearly undid me. Every one of those yellow buses looked harmless again the way they used to, until you remember that once one of them didn't take a child home. I rolled down the window, let the cold air hit my face, and whispered a promise I hoped she'd somehow hear. "You're going home now, kid. You made it back." But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The man who built that nightmare hadn't been found, not yet. And in every quiet corner of every small town, another bus idled in the cold doors, opening to trust. That's where the next part of this story begins. When the FBI finally brought Norah home, the town didn't know how to act. Pine Hollow had carried her name for so long that it had become something between a prayer and a ghost story. People left casseroles on Dana's porch again the way they did in the first weeks back in '94. Only this time they weren't sure if they were celebrating or mourning. I was there the afternoon she came back, thin as a reed, bundled in a gray blanket, her eyes shifting between the faces waiting at the county line. She looked at the town like someone staring into a dream they didn't quite believe in anymore. They didn't let many of us near her that first day, but from where I stood by the fence I saw Dana step forward. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. She said one word, "Baby," and Norah walked straight into her arms. No tears, no noise, just that long, silent hold that lasts through every lost year. I turned away before they pulled apart. Some moments belong only to the people who survived them. The trial never happened the way people imagined. By the time they tracked down Halverson, he was already in a hospital bed under a different name, dying from liver failure. When agents arrived, he asked one question. Did she talk, then smiled when they said she had. He died 2 days later before formal charges could be read. The Bureau filed the case closed by default, but none of us called it justice. It felt more like a story that had finally stopped running, not because it ended right, but because it just ran out of breath. The network he helped build unraveled after that. Tapes, records, payments, all tied back to a web of old educators, transport contractors, and shell organizations that had folded long before anyone could be prosecuted. The courts seized what was left, shut down the warehouses, and ordered the evidence archived under federal protection. But there are some things you can't lock away. The tapes still exist somewhere, filed under sealed case numbers, each one a window into a child's life that never had the chance to finish. I've seen enough of them to last me whatever time I've got left. Norah stayed in a rehabilitation center for a year. Her doctors said her mind worked like someone who'd lived 2 different lives, the one she remembered and the one she'd been taught to believe. When she spoke, she used short sentences as if the world had to earn her words again. Sometimes she'd ask what season it was or how long she'd been gone, and when someone told her, she'd nod like it made sense and then stare at the window for a long time. Dana moved to be closer to her. She'd bring photos from home, her old bedroom, the field behind the house, that purple hat, and Norah would look at them like they were pieces of someone else's dream. Then slowly she began to paint. Not scenes or faces, just colors, the kind that looked like sky before a storm or river ice catching sunlight. She said it helped her feel something without having to explain it. As for me, retirement never really took after that. I started volunteering with a missing persons unit out of Madison, helping train young deputies on how to handle cold cases. I tell them to pay attention to the things that don't fit neatly on paper, the small gaps in a schedule, a name that doesn't belong, a silence that lasts too long. Because that's where evil hides. Not in the dark, but in the ordinary. Halverson knew that better than anyone. He built a life inside the places people stopped looking. Every few months I drive past the field where the bus was found. The ground's leveled now. Grass has grown over it, but in the right light you can still see a faint depression in the soil, like the earth remembering what it once held. The county fenced the area off and planted a young oak in the center. There's a small plaque there. No headlines, no politics, just her name, and the words, "You made it home." When I stop there, I think about how many nights I sat in my patrol car watching that same corner of Finch Avenue, never knowing what was already set in motion. The town changed after that. Parents stopped letting their kids wait for buses alone. The district installed cameras on every route and started background checks that reached deeper than anyone thought possible. But more than that, people started watching each other again, not out of suspicion, but out of care. Pine Hollow had been a quiet place, once maybe too quiet. After Norah came home, quiet stopped meaning safe. Sometimes when I talk with Dana, she tells me Norah still dreams about the bus. Not the day she vanished, but something stranger. The way the snow looked on the windows, the smell of diesel, the sound of her own breath fogging the glass. She says it's peaceful, Dana told me once. She says that's how she wants to remember it. I think that's what healing looks like, choosing the piece of the story that hurts least and building a life around it. I get letters from people still asking about the case. They want to know if I ever got answers, if I believe she's really okay. Now, if I sleep any better knowing he's gone. I tell them the truth. No one comes out of something like this okay. Not her, not her mother, not the ones who chased the case so long we started to see her in every missing poster. But surviving isn't the same as being broken. Sometimes it's just what's left when the storm passes. On the anniversary of her return, the sheriff invited me to speak at the high school gym. I didn't plan on saying much, just a few words about vigilance and community. But when I stood there looking out at those rows of faces, kids the same age she'd been, I felt the years stack up. I told them about the little girl who used to wait on Finch Avenue, the one who waved to every driver who passed. I told them how a single lie, a man saying, "I'll take you where you need to go," changed everything. Then I told them what mattered most, that no one is ever too small to be remembered, and no amount of time can make the truth go away. Afterward, a student came up to me. She couldn't have been more than 16. She said my mom went to school with her. She said Norah used to draw flowers on all her papers. I nodded, not trusting my voice. That night I drove by Dana's place and saw light in the window. Through the glass I could see Norah at the table sketching. The shape on the paper looked like petals. Now, years later, I keep a copy of her last sketch in my desk drawer. It's simple: a bus under a tree, both outlined in soft pencil with a trail of small blossoms drifting away into the sky. At the bottom, she wrote Day 1. No fear, no sorrow, just the quiet beginning she never got to have back then. When people ask me what this story means, I tell them it's not about monsters or miracles. It's about what happens when the world forgets to look and what it costs to remember again. It's about the difference between closure and peace. One you can file away, the other takes a lifetime. Sometimes I drive out to the edge of town after dark and park where the old bus stop used to be. The streetlight hums, the snow falls soft, and for a moment the world feels small enough to hold. I imagine her walking home now, older, slower maybe, but free. The sound of the engine long gone, replaced by the crunch of her boots on clean snow. I don't wait for anything anymore. I just sit there and listen. Because some stories don't end when the case closes. They end when the silence around them finally feels different, when it stops being heavy and starts being still. That's what this one has become. Not an open wound, not even a scar, just a quiet place where memory breathes. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.